Good day, ECO736 students. Welcome to week 4 of Development Economics. For the next 2 weeks, we will look at measuring poverty and inequality. In terms of our agenda, you will submit your weekly reading assignment number 3 before the lecture on Thursday. Those who are scheduled to present will also submit the presentation before our Thursday lecture. You are required to review the lecture slides and clips so that you can engage in our discussion on the eCanva platform on Thursday. Please make use of the lessons tool in eCanva as well, just to ensure that you are on track with everything you need to do for each week. As per usual, your marked weekly reading assignment from last week has been uploaded into your Dropbox folder on eCanva. Please check that out as well. In terms of session outcomes, after this week, you should be able to use prevailing methods to measure poverty. You should also be able to discuss some of the practical issues that arise when you use different methods to measure poverty, and also discuss why some methods are preferable to others. So let's start off by thinking about what poverty is. What is the nature of poverty? Well, it's difficult to define uniquely because poverty is a multidimensional concept. In general, there are two broad approaches that are used to identify and measure poverty. One of it is quantitative in nature, which is mainly the money metric approach, and the other approach is more qualitative in nature, and it's fairly subjective, where composite indicators are used, such as consumption of private and public goods and welfare outcomes. Something else to consider when thinking about poverty is looking at relative poverty versus absolute poverty. With absolute poverty, it is anchored in a specific attainment of certain basic capabilities, and we will look more at that when we look at poverty lines, which are established either through food energy intakes or cost of basic needs methods. There is also relative poverty, which is more arbitrary, more of an arbitrary concept. For example, looking at the bottom 40% of the income distribution, or looking at the top 20% of the income distribution. So in an instance like that, poverty is expressed in relative terms. So throughout the next 2 weeks, we will look at measurements of both absolute poverty as well as relative poverty. When measuring poverty, there are quite a few things one needs to consider, because it will have implications in terms of how one interprets what the findings are. First of all, you need to decide which welfare indicator are you going to use when measuring poverty. Are you going to measure income, or are you going to measure consumption or expenditure? Something else which one needs to consider is which poverty line do you set? Because there are issues that come with setting a poverty line too high, but more on that later. You also need to decide on the unit of analysis. Are you going to measure poverty at a household level or at an individual level? If individual, per capita or per adult equivalent, you need to consider that children cost less, and that in larger households there may be economies of scale that come into play. We will spend quite a lot of time looking at the empirical literature on Foster, Greer, and Thorbecke's poverty measures, and you will need to learn how to do that. And towards the end of this lecture, we'll just touch on a multidimensional poverty index. From next week, we will look at cumulative density functions and dominance testing, which is an approach used to avoid the shortcomings of poverty lines, and we will also focus on inequality next week as well. Right, so when it comes to the choice of using income data versus consumption or expenditure data when measuring poverty, development economists tend to use consumption or expenditure data more often than income data when we want to measure poverty amongst poorer subgroups of society. This is because many poor people are often unemployed and their income varies more over seasons and over periods of times, so they may not be reporting on the income as clearly or as correctly as they would for consumption. So in the poorer subsets of your income distribution, someone may not always be able to tell you how much they earn in terms of income, but they would be more clear in terms of telling you how much they spend and on what they spend it every month. Okay. Furthermore, consumption or expenditure data will also consider effects of savings or withdrawals from accumulated savings. So consumption smoothing is captured within that. So by and large, if we are doing any kind of empirical analysis for poverty measurements, we would rather tend to use consumption and expenditure data, even though sometimes we do look at both. But at the lower end of the income distribution, your consumption and expenditure data would be more accurately relayed than your income data. Two terms that you'll often see in your prescribed readings are incidence and share. And you need to be able to distinguish between the two because they mean very different things. When we're talking about poverty incidence, we are referring to the prevalence of poverty within a certain group. Basically, the percentage of poor people within a certain group, whether it's a geographical group, sex, gender, etc. In the example here, they say the incidence of poverty in Northwest Province is 51.5%. Okay? And so basically, if you had to calculate that, what they do is the numerator would be the number of poor people in the Northwest, and the denominator would be all the people in the Northwest Province. When it comes to the share of poverty for a specific group, in this case the Northwest Province, the term specifically considers both the incidence as well as the group size. So the share of Northwest Province amongst the poor is 8.9%. So the calculation there is very different to how you would calculate incidence. So your numerator in this case would be the same as it was before. It would be the number of poor people in the Northwest Province, but your denominator would be all poor people in the country, for example. Okay, so the percentage that you got in that instance, which was 8.9%, is therefore very different to the 51.5%, which was the incidence. Please revise this slide again. It may take a while to get the hang or the meaning of the differences, but play around with examples. This becomes critical when you're doing empirical analysis, because sometimes students get confused between incidences and shares, and they mix up they use the wrong denominators. So you need to be very clear about that. So when we are measuring absolute poverty, when we, for example, determine the different FGT measures, we need a poverty line. Okay, so there are two methods of basically constructing a poverty line. The first method is the cost of basic needs method, And the second method is the food poverty line method. So the cost of basic needs method will consider the cost of a basket of goods that is regarded as basic needs and how much that amounts to. That could be one way of determining a poverty line. Or the food poverty line method, which rather looks at a statistical fit between household food consumption and calories consumed to determine the food consumption expenditure required to meet the minimum calorie needs. Okay. You can read more about the details of these methods in your Thorbeck handout. It's important that you read those, but they are quite straightforward. When determining the poverty line, you also need to deal with price levels across time and space. So you would need to use deflators and price indices in those calculations. You also need to deal with household sizes because we know that they vary considerably depending on different factors. So you may need to use per capita or per adult equivalents when you consider that children cost less and economies of scale may be realized in larger household sizes. In many of the analyses that you may end up doing, you also need to make a call about whether you are going to do the measurement at a household or individual level, whether you're looking at deciles or quintiles, or whether you are constructing a Gini coefficient. Is this for a household or is it at an individual level? And then are you dealing with per household, per capita, or per adult equivalent? Remembering that the household size makes a difference to the needs. The more people, the more you need to consume. Thus, per capita is better. So you basically control for household size in your analyses. The household composition is also important. Is it a house filled with children, or is it a house filled with the elderly, etc.? Because you may assign different weights to adults and children. And you also need to consider that in larger households, economies of scale could be realized, as I've mentioned before. Okay, this slide basically looks at income, poverty, and deprivation amongst the poor in 1996 in the Eurozone. So you can see there are a few European countries there. How they define poverty, that is described here in the footnote, where poverty is defined as income below 60% of the national median. So they find out what the national median is, and if your income is below 60% of that national median, you would then be defined as poor. Okay, and you can see here the different income poverty rates. Okay, so that's the percentage of poor people by this definition within this country. Okay, so this here is an incidence. Okay, this is the incidence, poverty incidence. So amongst the poor, they then looked at the percentage of the poor who had difficulty making ends meet, who couldn't afford holidays away, who had bad health, or who met friends less than once a month. So this analysis over here, the denominator in this equation is what? It is the total amount of poor people. So it's the percent of poor who had ticked yes for any of these. And you can see that that varies by proxy, and it also furthermore varies by country. And you can wonder why this is not applicable in Italy, but just have a look at this and look at the differences between what you find here in terms of deprivation and in terms of the poverty incidence and how those figures relate. Some are far higher on this side and some are far lower, but it tells you a very unique story for each country when you look at poverty from different perspectives. And this takes us back to the first slide where we said that poverty is a multidimensional concept, so you can look at it from many different angles besides just income.